In this mini lecture, we will talk about how we can use fatty acids as a fuel source. The first part of fat metabolism that we're going to cover is the breakdown of fat to yield energy. It is a relatively simple process that involves the conversion of fatty acids to acetyl-CoA. This involves three main steps, which are listed on the slide. And half of this you've already learned, which is to utilize the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. The first step of fatty acid oxidation is that we activate the fatty acid, and this consumes 2 ATP. We're not going to get into the details of the actual activation of fatty acid, but what I want you to remember and what we'll come back to is that this process, this first step, consumes 2 ATP. So we're already in a net 2 loss of ATP. Once the fatty acid is activated in step 1, we can now convert it into a substrate that we know well, acetyl-CoA. So the second step is called beta oxidation or fatty acid oxidation. And this can undergo multiple rounds of fatty acid oxidation until we get to our 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. The process of fatty acid oxidation or beta oxidation is a sequence of steps that removes 2 carbons each round, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So each round of fatty acid oxidation, we're removing 2 carbons until we are left with the 2-carbon molecule, which is acetyl-CoA. For example, if we have a 16-carbon molecule that we need to break down, a 16-carbon fatty acid, we remove 2 carbons each round of fatty acid oxidation until we are left with the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. So essentially, we would go through 7 rounds of beta oxidation for a 16-carbon fatty acid until we are left with the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. After fatty acid oxidation or beta oxidation, when we convert the fatty acid to acetyl-CoA, that 2-carbon molecule, we can then utilize the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. Because remember, acetyl-CoA is the substrate for the citric acid cycle. Fat oxidation, or this whole process of fat metabolism, occurs in many tissues, especially the liver. And you've already learned 2/3 of the process of fat metabolism, which is the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. You now only need to learn one new process, which is the conversion of fat to acetyl-CoA. So before we do a summary of fat metabolism, I want to take a step back and relate this to our diet. So as mentioned in the previous mini lecture, what we eat is primarily triglycerides. So we have our glycerol molecule as the backbone with 3 fatty acids bound to it. And most of the fat we eat in our diet isn't found as triglycerides. So we eat a meal that has fat in it. It gets digested in the stomach initially, and then mostly in the small intestine is where we see the absorption of the fatty acids and the glycerol into the blood. Now we have fatty acids traveling in the blood. They can combine with the glycerol again to form monoglycerides, diglycerides, and then triglycerides, and stored for when we need to break them down again as energy source. But if we need them right away, those fatty acids will travel through the cell membrane or the cytoplasmic membrane into the cell. So now we have our fatty acids in the cytoplasm. But where fat metabolism occurs or fatty acid oxidation occurs is in the mitochondria. So we firstly must move the fatty acids into the mitochondrial matrix where oxidation occurs. Then the fatty acid undergoes beta oxidation, which removes 2 carbons per round or per time of fatty acid oxidation or beta oxidation. It's the same words, mean the same thing. And each round of fatty acid oxidation produces 1 NADH and 1 FADH2, which then go on to the electron transport chain and yield energy. So for example, if we have a 16-carbon fatty acid, this will go through 7 rounds of beta oxidation. So we have a removal of 14 carbons total, 2 carbons each round to yield acetyl-CoA. And then the final product is a 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. So what I do is when I see a fatty acid, say it's 16-carbon fatty acid, I automatically remove 2 carbons. So I go 16 carbons minus 2 carbons equals 14 carbons. Because we know that the final end product is a 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. So we can remove those 2 carbons right away. So now we're left with 14 carbons that go through the rounds of beta oxidation. And if we know that 2 carbons are removed each round of beta oxidation, we divide the 14 carbons by 2 to get 7. And that's how many rounds of fatty acid oxidation or beta oxidation the fatty acid needs to go through in order to yield the end product of the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. So now let's go over the summary of beta oxidation. You don't need to know all the steps involved in beta oxidation. What you need to know is what the inputs and outputs are each round of beta oxidation and the location of beta oxidation. So essentially, beta oxidation is also known as fat oxidation. And the location of this is in the mitochondrial matrix because we just moved the fatty acid from the cytoplasm into the mitochondrial matrix where we can break it down and yield NADH, FADH2, and acetyl-CoA. The reducing equivalents will go to the electron transport chain and generate energy through ATP synthase. And the acetyl-CoA will travel to the citric acid cycle, which is also in the mitochondrial matrix, and undergo the citric acid cycle to yield more reducing equivalents. So as you can see on the slide, we have our equation, or the summary of beta oxidation as an equation, where we have our activated fatty acid known as fatty acetyl-CoA. We insert a FAD, which is a coenzyme. We also have another coenzyme, NAD. We combine that with water, so it's a hydration reaction, plus a coenzyme A. So lots of things happening here being added. And this is the entire process of what's going on with beta oxidation. The products, therefore, are fatty acetyl-CoA minus 2. So the N minus 2 means that this fatty acetyl-CoA is now minus 2 carbons, plus FADH2, plus NADH, plus a hydrogen ion, and also our acetyl-CoA molecule. Okay, so beta oxidation continues. As we can see, all the steps are in the cycle that we see in the diagram on the slide. You don't need to know all of these. You need to know essentially the inputs and the outputs in the equation above, and that the process of beta oxidation removes 2 carbons each time around while yielding or producing some reducing equivalents that go to the electron transport chain. So every cycle of beta oxidation produces 1 acetyl-CoA, 1 FADH2, 1 NADH, and 1 hydrogen ion. And this cycle continues until that fat is left with 2 carbons, which will be an acetyl-CoA molecule. If you go through beta oxidation once, you will reduce the length of the carbon chain by 2 carbons. You will also make 1 molecule of FADH2 and 1 molecule of NADH, as well as a molecule of acetyl-CoA. Remember that when we said that most fatty acids are 10 to 22 carbon atoms in length, this means if we want to break the chain down so that it only has 2 carbons left, we will have to go through beta oxidation several times, ultimately producing many molecules of FADH2, NADH2, and acetyl-CoA. This is the equation, again, of the reactants or the substrates involved in beta oxidation and the products of beta oxidation for 1 round of beta oxidation. A question that is really important and which you need to know for the test is how many ATP are produced from 1 round of beta oxidation. So remember, 1 round of beta oxidation produces 1 NADH, which produces 2.5 ATP in the electron transport chain. 1 round of beta oxidation also produces 1 FADH2, which produces 1.5 ATP in the electron transport chain. 1 round of beta oxidation also produces 1 acetyl-CoA molecule, which produces 1 round of the citric acid cycle. And remember, the products of the citric acid cycle will yield 10 ATP total in the electron transport chain and with the 2 GDP that are produced in the citric acid cycle. So we have 10 ATP produced from 1 acetyl-CoA in the CAC, plus 2.5 from 1 NADH at the electron transport chain, plus 1.5 from the FADH2 in the electron transport chain produces 14 ATP per round of beta oxidation. Try to do that math. If you need help with it, please let me know. Now let's go through an example together of the energy yield from fatty acid oxidation for one of the body's most common fatty acids, and this is palmitic acid. Your body actually produces this regularly. It is 16 carbons in length. It's also known as palmitate. So remember, the first step involved in fat metabolism is to activate the fatty acid to fatty acetyl-CoA, which consumes 2 ATP. So we're already in a net loss of 2 ATP. So therefore we have minus 2 for the first. Then we'll address the 16 carbons of the palmitic acid. So remember, 2 carbons are removed from beta oxidation each cycle. So therefore we must be left with 2 carbons, which is acetyl-CoA. So if we have 16 carbons minus 2 carbons per cycle equals 14 carbons divided by 2 equals 7 rounds of beta oxidation. Remember, for each round of beta oxidation, we produce 1 FADH2. So if we have 7 rounds of beta oxidation, we have 7 FADH2. And they're worth 1.5 ATP produced in the electron transport chain. So the total would be 7 FADH2 times 1.5 ATP produced in the electron transport chain equals 10.5 ATP from FADH2. Now let's talk about the NADH. So for every 1 round of beta oxidation, we produce 1 NADH. So if we have 7 rounds of beta oxidation for a 16 carbon palmitic acid, we produce 7 NADH molecules. We know that 2.5 ATP are produced per 1 NADH in the electron transport chain. So 7 times 2.5 equals 17.5 ATP produced from 7 NADH. Now let's talk about the acetyl-CoA that's produced. So we have 8 acetyl-CoA produced because we have a 16 carbon palmitic acid. So 16 carbons divided by 2 carbons removed each cycle of beta oxidation means that we have 8 acetyl-CoA produced, which enter the citric acid cycle or the tricarboxylic acid cycle. So 1 round of the TCA or the CAC, the same thing, yields 3 NADH, 1 FADH2, and 1 GTP. So we times that by 8. Firstly, if we know that we produce 10 ATP per citric acid cycle, and we know that there's 8 cycles that the 8 acetyl-CoA have to go through, then the total is 10 ATP per cycle times 8 cycles is a total of 80 ATP produced from 8 acetyl-CoA. Then what we do is add everything together. So we have our minus 2 plus 10.5 ATP plus 17.5 from the NADH plus the 80 produced from the 8 acetyl-CoA is a grand total of 106 ATP. So from one 16 carbon fatty acid, we can yield 106 ATP, which is a huge amount. Remember, from 1 glucose, we were around 30 to 32 to 34 maximum. Now with 1 fatty acid, we can yield 106 ATP. There's just more steps involved, and that's why it's relatively slower than glucose metabolism. However, with fat metabolism and using fatty acids as a fuel, we can generate a lot of ATP. Now, I would like you to walk through this example on your own. This is for a 20 carbon fatty acid. So essentially, what is the ATP yield from a 20 carbon fatty acid? And essentially, I walk through the steps here with you, and I want to see if you can get this number on your own. So the grand total is 144 ATP yield from one 20 carbon fatty acid. Lastly, I'm providing you with 2 examples that I want you to try on your own and which I will take up at the beginning of class this week. The first one is how many ATP are produced from an 8 carbon fatty acid, And the second question is how many ATP are produced from a 22 carbon fatty acid? As mentioned, I will start with these two examples in our class this week. But challenge yourself to try to get the answer on your own, and then we'll walk through it to challenge your learning.